1918. Now, it's very hard for me to say exactly why I chose medicine, but I can try. You know, I was in a humanistic gymnasium 8 years, and we went in that period over most areas which were fit to be learned about. So that, though predominantly it was Greek and Latin, we went into history and into natural sciences, physics, mathematics, practically everything one could really consider. So that we in these 8 years, from 10 to 18, had plenty of opportunity to choose, to decide. And finally I decided medicine is it, and it stayed it for good. I'll tell you how that was really. Now, I heard about Freud 2 years before I went to medical school. In the gymnasium, I was pretty young, 17. And it was in the 7th grade, in psychology class. And one of the students got up and told us that her father, a physician in Vienna, had played cards with a friend, Dr. Freud, every Saturday. And Freud told him and the other men in the group that academic psychology disregards some very important parts of what is going on psychologically in people and what motivates them and what influences their life, though they are not aware of it. And he called these factors unconscious factors. Now, I was a very curious youngster. I still am curious. And on my way home, I dropped in at Deuticke, who was then the publisher of Freud, and asked for some of his writings. And they gave me The Wit and its relationship to the unconscious. I didn't like it at all. It was confusing. It wasn't even interesting. But I didn't give up. I went back, asked for another book. And that time they gave me the psychopathology of everyday life. Now that was very different. It was thought-provoking. It was really very interesting. Still in the gymnasium, in the 7th grade. Now, 2 years later, I was in medical school. And I remember very well, I was sitting in an anatomy lecture between 2 returning veterans. The First World War had just ended. It was 1918. The names were Edward Bibring and Wilhelm Reich. Both of them became rather known in this country and abroad later on. Now, a little note was passed around, and on it was written, those colleagues who want to know more about certain subjects which are not taught in medical school or are not taught well should stay back after the lecture. Signed Otto Fenichel, also a man who became very known as a leading psychoanalyst later on. I said to my 2 neighbors, I'm very interested in it. This man is very good. I knew him from childhood. We played in the sandbox together. And somehow we all stayed there, all 3. Then there was Otto Fenichel. Then there was another student who wanted to become an endocrinologist, and somebody who wanted to go into internal medicine. And we set up a seminar, a review seminar, to study these things. Now, we set up a seminar, a review seminar, to read the books, and we started with very conservative things, with textbooks on endocrinology. And then we read Fries, who was a close friend of Freud, but we didn't know about that, who had the most interesting idea about human physiology. Not correct one, but interesting. Then I think we read Havelock Ellis. And then we had an assignment to report Freud's 3 contributions to the theory of sex. And the student who had to review it was Edward Bibring. Now he came back to our seminar and he said, "This is the most interesting and most irritating book." And I piped up and I said, and when I thought back, I really got quite embarrassed about this remark the older I got, until I got old enough not to be embarrassed, but amused and touched by it. I said, "Oh, this is a very famous man and a very great man. I have read some of his writings already." Now, you mustn't forget, a youngster of 17, I had read 2 books, whereas these men, they were 5 years my elders, were in the war, in prisoners of war in Russia, and I was in the luxury of literature and science and could do whatever fed my spirit. So nobody held it against me, this remark. And we went on, really working very hard on it, setting up more and more of these studies, which was later on, when we became psychoanalysts, was called the Seminar of the Children. We were the children at that time. So this is how I got into it. Already at that time, I'll tell you what, at that time already, not only Freud, the other analysts too. What we did, there was a tradition in Vienna, I don't know whether it still exists. Every doctor had office hours set aside, 1 or 2 hours in the afternoon. And you could come to him without a carefully arranged appointment. So we went to the analysts whose books we read, including Freud, and asked him simply, what does that mean? What does he advise we should read after that? And sometimes we debated simply the issues with them. And it was in the 1920s early. There was no institute in Vienna. I don't know, I think we were all like that, really concentrating on what we were doing. And as there was no institute, we were not spoiled with routine and programs. We found it quite in order. We were then 4 students. That was Feniche, Reich, the 2 Bibrings, by then married to each other, to be invited by Freud to be guests in the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, which we became. And this is how we met him, and this is how our professional life started. I think, if I had known what you will ask, I would have looked it up.
Well,
but I think it was 26 about. Helene Deutsch, who had her training in Berlin, had come back to us and told us about an institute in Berlin and how it functioned. And we thought we should have an institute. So we established an institute, made Helene Deutsch the first chairman of the education committee. And then we did something very improper. We felt we have no credentials, no formal credentials. So we thought we should have certificates for us. We were the young faculty, never trained, but by ourselves. And we really printed certificates. And 5 of them were issued, signed by Freud and by Helene Deutsch. And then we all found that this is improper. And we discarded all the other certificates. Nobody else got them. We felt that is really not right. But these 5 exist still in the safety vaults or in the Congress, in the Library of Congress. Negatively, there was a lot of fight against, aversion against Freud, psychoanalysis. I tell you, he had a great scandal when he first reported the theory of hysteria, and when the sex problem came up. And it was a real scandal in the Vienna Medical Society. And this was really why he could never progress in his career as far as university was concerned. And we all were really somehow looked upon as a little bit outcasts. It wasn't right, you know. The funny thing is that my love was anatomy. It was so clean and so clear and so informative. And I really slowly got more and more into medicine. But I had this humanistic background. But in the last 2 years of my medical school, Dr. Cooper, I matriculated in philosophy too. You know, we were not quite as natural scientists as you very often hear when you go into medicine. We were humanists. Yes, in medicine, yes. But we didn't keep to it completely. That is, we did apart from it. But we felt it's important and interesting. Look here. First of all, the official institute disbanded. That is, it was confiscated. But there was a small core of underground analysts who stayed in Vienna. Now, let me try to tell you how this thing developed. We all stayed for all kinds of reasons. Responsibilities, our work, our loyalties. We all knew that it will come. That wasn't naive. Sure, but you know, we had occasion in 1936 already to go to Detroit to set up an institute. And we felt we couldn't do that. You know, you couldn't just run away. So we stayed. And I remember I said to my husband, we will run and leave everything, but we will run with a light heart. That was the case, though it was pretty hard too. Now, I can't vouch for Freud's motives, but he was 82 and probably didn't want to be uprooted, and probably hoped, from what he said sometimes, that to stay there might protect the institute, the publishing house, the documents. He was completely wrong. So Jones came to Vienna, Ernest Jones, and persuaded Freud to come to London. Freud insisted that he would go only when some of his editors would also go. So Jones promised a common immigration visa, but he was very active for a long time in the United States. He introduced, really, to a certain extent, together with Freud and Putnam, you know, it was an interesting. I remember once he had a number of very close American friends. So it wasn't against the American people per se. It was against something which wasn't so wrong. This kind of what he felt is business spirit, and the fear that analysis would become part of it, which for a certain period. I remember once, it's a little anecdote, we had a meeting in his house, and he came in with a letter. He was a very witty man, with a letter, and showed us the letter. The appearance of the letter was a letter, and there was a slit, and the 10 cents was slipped into it. And the letter was asking the famous professor to send his signature to the the signed. And he put in 10 cents for the stamp. So, you know, somehow he felt that is part of something which he didn't like. But I think he was. And he was afraid that, and it is something which really isn't for the marketplace, if it doesn't study the marketplace, but it doesn't function well in the marketplace. No, I understand. Remember, once we were in a curriculum meeting outside, what was this place? Not Endicott House? And I wrote in Greek, Axios of Elaine tous Alguntas, because the whole group talked about natural sciences in medicine, and nobody cared for the psyche. And you said something very drastic. I had to go upstairs to get my seat, and I heard Dr. Cope say, in this typically facetious way of his, he said, Dr. Bibring had the audacity to write something here on the table, which nobody in the house understands but she. I wrote it in Greek, Some of his editors, and now my husband was one of them, and all these editors, interestingly enough, were married to psychoanalytic ladies. So, 1 year, the work was beautiful. Then came the war. Freud died in 1939. The publishing house was bombed. A large percentage of the British psychoanalysts reasonably evacuated themselves. It was so serious when the Blitz started that we really expected our boys might not see us over the weekend anymore. And then the German invasion was threatening. So Glover offered seriously that if something happens to us, he would adopt the children. Now, a lovely colleague of ours, Willy Hoffer, who had died in the meantime, became an air raid warden. And every morning he went around, either by telephone or personally, to his friends to see whether they are still there. This was the situation. And then came one day an invitation for my husband to come to Tufts Medical School. Warren Stearns had invited him with an appointment. Partly, when we came, we had a number of friends here, former students, colleagues. It was delightful to come to Boston and suddenly discover how many of our friends were here. And they told us, introduced us into the American ways of life. Now, the interesting thing was that they told us, here in the United States, a doctor gives some service to a hospital. Now, that wasn't our habit. What we did, we had our own psychoanalytic outpatient clinic, which we supported ourselves. But it was very interesting, and we were told that the Israel Hospital, which is a first-grade hospital, has an outpatient, a psychiatric outpatient clinic, which is almost exclusively occupied by psychoanalysts in Boston. Now, we were there in the outpatient clinic. Then came the war. And so many of our colleagues had to go into service. And somehow they appointed me as the acting head of the outpatient clinic. Now, fine. And the house officers, the interns and residents, felt troubled because they had so little teaching. All the big men were gone. So they even came to me and said whether I wouldn't teach them how my specialty fits into medicine. So I was very glad to do so. Now there was something which I didn't expect to turn out so beautifully. I taught them, but the only hour we had was from 1 to 2. Now they all came and sat down, and half of them fell asleep because it was after lunch and they were so overworked. So I talked to the other half, and I was much too sympathetic with them to take it an issue, make an issue of it. The next time, the other half was asleep, and some of them were awake. So I acquired the habit of summarizing what I had done the time before. Now, this they never forgot. They really became the favorite of theirs, apart from the fact that I think the lectures were really interesting. They were quite excited over it. So when Dr. Blumgart became the new physician-in-chief, returning from India after the war, he brought with him some observation that most of the soldiers, apart from their physical illnesses, had severe psychological disturbances. And he had the ingenious idea that psychiatry really belongs into a general hospital. And he offered me that. And I said, no. You know, I wanted to go back. I told him, I said, I don't know enough about American hospitals. I have never run a department. I can't push people around if I know less than they do. And he said so constantly. He repeated, it's all to the better. And finally he said something which got me in my flight. He said, you know, this is the way you psychoanalysts always are. When we try to do something psychological with our sick patients, you look down your noses and you say it's all wrong. And we say, come and help us. You say, sorry, I'm too busy. And I knew he was right. And it bothered me. And I also admired this exact, wonderful psychological gimmick he had to hit me where I'm vulnerable. You know, years later, it turned out that it wasn't a gimmick. He really meant what he said, because the doctors think they are closest to God. And they know everything. And they are always against new ideas, which they haven't applied themselves. You have to think of Semmelweis. You have to think of Mesmer, of Freud. That is, they are an awfully orthodox group. And we understand, you know, they have to know, and they have really the life, the responsibility for the life of people. It makes them more rigid, number one. Number two, it's a field for which you have to be gifted. It isn't something which you can just learn by rote. You have to have a feeling for people. This is not so good, you know. That's not scientific. And then I'll tell you one thing which always impressed me. People just don't know what analysis is. You know, even people who talk it, apply it in their fields, in their daily language, and have no idea what it really represents. And they attack it, even scientists. Scientists really write against it and use it and are not aware of it. For instance, it's not anymore, since we are not such a fad any longer, but you could come to a cocktail party and clearly somebody was telling a dream to somebody else, and the somebody else said, oh, you wanted to kill your wife? Now, they didn't even know that top thing has nothing to do with what is underneath, you know? That is, they understood a little bit that a dream has a significance, but they didn't understand how to get at it, or transference, or that's so nice, the silent analyst. There is the joke, you know, about the analysts. The couch, cartoons. There's the couch, there's the patient, there's the analyst with a beard, a pad, and a certificate on the wall over the patient. Now, first, we don't all have beards. Second, we don't put our certificate. And we don't have a pad, only when we want to make a special note for something, if we work on something, or young candidates in training write down because they're afraid when they come to their supervisors, they're forgotten. However, the couch is no joke. It's a relaxing thing, which we want to introduce. We don't want the patient to sit and look at us the way we look at our vis-a-vis, and then say what we think is acceptable and what isn't. This is our whole most important tool. We call it free association. That the patient relaxes, looks inward, and says what comes up. This is why the analyst sits behind him, so that he doesn't scan his face, and the analyst can do what is his main obligation, to listen very carefully and not to try to control his expressions. Now, this listen carefully means he doesn't do anything. I had a patient who came to me, and when he was on the couch for the first time, he said, "Dr. Bibring, are you one of those analysts where the patient detects after 2 years that the doctor was dead 2 years ago already?" So I said, "No. With me you will find out after 1 year." And then we started a very fruitful analysis. I don't try to influence, I try to offer a suggestion, what we call an interpretation. At the time when we feel that the pattern has come close together, it makes sense. What he said last time and what he said in the first hour and what he said today. And we feel we understand something and the patient can understand it with it. We don't throw it at him just because we think it's right. If we are good analysts, you understand. Now, but look here, there's such a difference in the overall technique of the medical person and in the overall technique of the psychoanalyst. You know, we keep things in abeyance. As I said, the first dream and the present dream and his slip and his symptom, all has to stay there until we think we see the pattern. You doctors go like that. You know, this doesn't belong, this doesn't belong, this doesn't belong, this doesn't belong. You go directly as to what is useful at this moment. This is this kind what some doctors call their tunnel thinking. And we think in this kind. Look here, it's very hard to know really. Look here, I have been asked that many times, and it's very hard to really come down to what it is. I can give you a few ideas I have. First of all, I think I take my job very seriously, and I don't like gaps in my knowledge which one could fill. And my husband and I, we had a joking but very realistic statement. When we didn't understand something in our field very well, we decided to give a course on it. Number one, it's very good, very helpful. Number two, I always did my homework. I don't slough off things, really. I can't live with myself when I'm sloppy in that form. Number three, perhaps because I was a foreigner, perhaps because I didn't fit into anything quite. You mustn't disregard. Perhaps you might as a woman and as a foreigner and as everything what the others are not. First of all, I don't mind little disadvantages, really. I'm not sensitive. Yes, but in very other fields. For disrespect, yes, but for lack of knowledge, no. So you understand, I probably was quite flexible, and I just didn't think of it. I'm very hesitant, because I learned here, coming from a patriarchal environment, Vienna. I learned here about the way women feel about their position. And I do believe that here things have gotten out of hand. Because I remember when I had so many friends in the medical school, in the institute, most of them were men. And something came to my attention very unpleasantly. We had many guests. And we were interested people, and they were interested people. And we had and discussions on everything. They came with their wives. And all these women were college graduates and didn't open their mouth. And I was the only woman. And I was embarrassed because I was the hostess. That is, there was something in that family pattern which obviously never came to my attention in my own home. In Vienna, I was taken for granted like another student. And I never thought of it. And I was a maverick, probably, because when I went to medical school, there were perhaps 5 women in medical school. I found it delightful that there were so many men, because what happened when the movement started, the liberation movement, I had a number of urgent calls, and the people who wanted to talk to me were women, young women in the liberation movement. And they came always armed with Freud's writing on women. Now, they asked me, how could you work with such a man? We never thought of it. I mean, he appreciated us. He made no distinction, but he had a certain theory about women, that they have a weaker conscience, meaning superego, on the basis of their special anatomical difference, etc. I don't want to go into all that. I just tell you that he saw women of the turn of the century, deeply repressed, deeply frustrated, playful, nothing to do. Even my patients were already completely different. And he formulated a theory about what he thought. He always used clinically observations to form a theory, gave it up when he found that it was wrong. And later on, with the new lectures, etc., he said, probably I don't understand women, what is specific, and it might need women analysts to help us out. Now, I don't think it needs women analysts. If that were the case, I wouldn't understand men patients either. And what I think is specific female, or the woman can tell it to you. And if you are a person who can listen, you will understand it. Otherwise, as I said, I wouldn't understand you either. Because you are a man, you have different needs. I'm fully aware of the difference in need. Oliver, you touch on something very complicated. I tell you why. There are differences in the emotional reaction. But if I get into that now, I can just highlight it. I do believe women usually are closer to childhood, to emotions, because their whole biological function somehow directs them in that way. And certain things in a woman might be very influenced by this even yet unproduced caretaking. Shall I tell you what one of my students said? Somebody asked in my seminar, why do men really marry? So one of the students said, because they want a housekeeper who stays put. Well, you make a difference between friendship and sexuality as if they were really things of a completely different breed. This is what is the great misunderstanding of Freud, that when he talks about the biological foundation and the drives, and the sex drive as one of the most important things shaping our adjustment, he talks not just about pure sex and intercourse. He talks about all the derivatives of this love, whether it's for nature, whether it's for people. This all he comprises in his concept of love and sex. So you can't say it isn't sex. It is sublimated and it is a redirected type. But there is something underneath this need for closeness, for people. We just call that all part of the primitive, low down sexual drive. And this is what people misunderstand. But you know, we say it's a derivative of this very primitive, deep-down drive. What's wrong with that? So you understand, this is what I say, they know about psychoanalytic concepts, but they don't understand them really. They always think we talk about nothing but sex. I can assure you that there can be half a year without ever touching on it, on its direct, simple form. We talk about attachment, we talk about all kinds of things. Now, homosexuality, for instance, it is Freud who says, like a good anatomist, that we are bisexual. Yeah. I don't think quite so, though. You know, the beauty of all this psychoanalysis is that there is nothing that can be said for everybody. Everything is different, and we are used to try to figure out where the difference is. However, a little bit in general, I can say, you know, a boy grows up with an attachment to his mother and shifts, transfers it to the girls and to the women. When this attachment is disturbed to such a point that he has to avoid women, that is a much more deep-rooted problem for him, because it breaks, so to speak, his, let us call it, normal development. This is what I mean. It can be an unusually strong love. It can be an unusually strong fear of the father and a submissiveness to father. It can come from an unusually strong conflict with mother, so that one turns to father for compensation. Did I say enough possibilities? But you know, there is now in the population a trend away from psychoanalysis. It's an anti-intellectual trend. Analysis before was mysterious, too mysterious, because of symbols and dreams. Now it's too intellectual. And the younger generation goes towards mysterious experiences, gurus, astrologers, the primal scream, the touch, the sensitivity group, with a hope to cleanse themselves by an emotional discharge.